All right, all right. Oversight or overstep. That was just, for my part, that was insight, Ben. So, okay. How about group one or room one, I guess? Anybody have anything to report there in terms of kind of a definition for oversight and when it might turn to overstepping?
Thanks, Lon. This is Mariah for group one. And I'm not sure we fully followed the line of questions here in the slide, but for us, oversight became, we're all fairly new, or at least a handful of us were fairly new to our role as board members, but oversight becomes overstepping with regard to a board when they act almost in a micromanagement role, perhaps stepping in to ask staff directly for information, or being at meetings that that the board isn't required to attend. And then there was a little bit of confusion, though, with regard to organizations that don't have an executive director or paid staff per se. Volunteers mainly do the work, the brunt of the work, and then you have the board. So that kind of distinction was a little gray for us.
Okay, yeah, and that's a good one. So maybe we'll pick that up as a question here before we end the conversation, because frankly, I hadn't thought about that, but that's very true. So, okay, how about room two? Anything, what did you guys come up with?
Yeah, so this is Karen. And I talked about the fact that I served on a board where there was one member of the board who, of course, the budget was always talked about and presented. But this one board member wanted to go into every little penny and where every single little penny went. And it was so frustrating because it just seemed like we spent all our time talking about pennies and not getting the big picture.
That's right. Yeah. So even within the board structure itself, there can be kind of what we would call overstepping. And I don't know if any of you have ever gone through the what is it, the Boson Griggs, that working styles exercise where you figure out, am I an orange or am I a blue?
Is that Myers-Briggs?
Yeah, Myers-Briggs.
It is Myers-Briggs, because the boson, that's the God particle.
Yeah,
okay.
Right. So Myers-Briggs, right. And that can be really helpful in getting, having boards understand the makeup of the board. And I'll tell you, if you have a whole bunch of real data hounds in there, everybody's green on your board, you're going to end up where Karen said you're going to be. You're going to be talking about pennies all the time. And it's going to be hard to make a decision. So, yeah, but that's true. That's a great observation that sometimes even within the board, you can have that happen. Okay, how about room three? Okay, nothing new from room three. Okay.
I hope I wasn't in room three.
Yes, you were, Ben.
Oh, well, look. No, well, look. The whole who's laughing? I hear someone laughing. The thing is that my thing is that I just tend to talk a lot, as you guys can probably discern from the past couple of meetings. I talk a lot. I want to know immediately if I have a question, I want to ask it. And I think that I'm overstepping as a board member a lot of times in trying to figure out where we're at the moment, like the executive director is giving out all of this monetary information that I'm not certainly personally concerned about, but at the same time, I need to understand it. And that was my thing, is can a board member do that? Can I overstep in not following protocol and kind of breaking in and interjecting every chance I get?
Okay. Yeah. So again, that's a little bit of a different twist on it. So part of what I'm getting from your comment there is, you acting as a board member, you're going to be asking for information from your executive director, but maybe also just from when the board is discussing things, is it okay if I ask those questions? And I would say that for the most part, it is okay as long as it's on the topic that's being discussed at the time. So if you look at your agenda, are we talking about, item A, and are you asking questions that pertain to item A? And as long as you're not just kind of going back over and over and over again, kind of repeating things, then that's acceptable. But if you're on item A and you're asking about item D, then that might not be quite right. And you might think, well, there's a connection there. So let's, well, maybe, okay, let's take up item D when we get there. But in terms of overstepping between your role as a board member and the management of the organization, that would only really occur, if you were asking an inordinate amount of questions that really hamper the administrator to be able to kind of do their job. So I think that's a balance that you kind of have to realize in your relationship with that person. And then at some point, the board might also say, okay, like we said before, these are significant issues, and that should come to the board for approval and a request to the administrator. If it's really simple facts that the administrator can provide, then that is something that's okay. Did somebody else have a question or a comment?
This is Jetta. I was in the group with Ben, and I did say he was probably overstepping if he wasn't using the other tools that are hopefully available to him, like reading the board packet, meeting with other board members to get some background information outside of the meeting, to be respectful of the time commitment of the meeting. We've got other people who are expecting the meeting to be an hour and a half, and if you don't get past the first item because somebody's drilling down into the weeds, it gets really uncomfortable. So consent agenda, reading the packet, working at a committee level instead are all suggestions for doing your homework before the meeting.
Yeah, great point and great suggestions, Jetta. That's right.
And I understand that completely. She told me that already. Thank you.
You bet. Yeah. Well, it's a learning process, and it's kind of a culture that you got to kind of get acclimated to. So. Okay, room 5, or let's see, room 4. Anything from room 4?
Yeah, I had just mentioned from my experiences on the boards that I'm on that there's a potential, but the boards that I'm on have done a good job of mitigating it. But conflict of interest, if you don't address conflict of interest before you bring up a topic, for example, I'm on the Juneau Dance Theater board. So you have both instructors and you have parents sitting on the board. There's potential for us to bring up things that are not necessarily part within the scope of the board management.
Right.
So
Right. Yeah.
mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Good example. How about room 5? Did I see you wave your hand, Abel?
I was just noting that you were skipping group 4.
Okay,
But you
thanks.
back and got that. In our discussion, I think one of the biggest things that came out of it was partly an understanding that overreach can happen when there is a lack of clear communication between both the board members as a board and also between the board and the administrator or executive director. When it's not clear what roles are what and what your responsibilities are, there can be an unintentional overreaching circumstances that come up because you're just not sure of what it is that you're supposed to be doing. And so you get into either micromanaging from the board down to the executive director, and making the environment and space very uncomfortable for all of the other employees or other people, patrons of the group. And also, if the board isn't communicating very well with the director could potentially have an overreaching incident of creating and implementing their own policy for the organization without consulting the board first.
Yeah, great example. And I think that really does, what you were just speaking to comes back to that idea of expectations, right? So making sure that you have clear expectations for what the roles and responsibilities are for the board, where that is established, and then where the director, where that establishment of those roles and responsibilities is there. And I think that's really critical. And sometimes, especially with small boards and boards that are a little less formal, that can lead to some real misunderstandings that can create hard feelings, and you kind of become ineffective and you're not doing what you really want to do. So thinking about this and creating those expectations is really helpful. Any other comments or questions before we move on from this? Because we're going to explore this topic certainly some more here and then go through some scenarios. All right. So oversight, just by definition, really is the action of overseeing something. So an example is effective oversight of the financial reporting process. So do you get, regular financial statements, and does it come with information so that you can understand it as a board, so that you are exhibiting and conducting oversight in a way that's informed, and we call that informed oversight. Versus overstepping, so where again we've passed beyond or exceeded what our limit normally is, and with a board or with a director, executive director, you must not overstep your authority, because that can lead to obviously conflict, or sometimes it can void actions. It could legally cost you some problems as well. So let's take a little closer look at this. So what does this look like to everybody? Anybody recognize this yet? Well, how about if I go a little bit bigger?
I was just going to say, it looks like the painting from Starry Night.
Exactly. So it's hard to see what it is if you're too far, if you're too close to it, right? And you're only seeing a little bit of it. But from the board's perspective, as you get out, you get a broader perspective. And now as the board, you're at a level where you are really kind of thinking big picture. And that's where the board belongs. They don't belong in the minutia of everything that's going to go on day to day. For the most part, most boards should be in this area where they can see this whole picture, okay? Now, the one example, though, that was brought up, we have a small board and we really don't have a director. Maybe you have an executive committee, or you have a couple of people that kind of act in that particular way. And so there's some responsibilities that may be assigned to individuals to do certain aspects that the board has to do because it's shared as a responsibility between everybody. So that's definitely a little bit different dynamic, and determining what's oversight or overstep is a little harder in that regard. So let's look at some key terms in terms of what we're talking about. We said, well, what about governance? And governance is all about how the board acts and conducts itself in running the organization. Vice versa, you have the management piece, which is delegated to your one employee, if that's the case that you have, and that's your executive director, and then oversight, and then the body as a whole. So, what does the body, the overall group, want to make sure happens, and then overstep. So governance, we talked a little bit about this the very first meeting that we had. So it's really the way an organization rules. It sets norms and actions. Those are structured. You try to sustain them. They're regulated generally by your policies or your bylaws, and you're really supposed to be held accountable to those. So an organization is, for instance, is created to support for the benefit of a constituency that's operated through a democratic process. For most of you, that's what happens. You know, in an arts organization, I'm on the Juneau Jazz and Classics board. You know, we were founded to provide jazz and classical, bring jazz and classical music to Juneau, and so that's our mission, right? That's what we're really trying to do, and so we're working towards that constituency, and we have a board of directors that operates through a democratic process to help guide the governance of the organization. While the management, of course, is kind of self-explanatory, but they're the ones that are going to do the day in, day out work. They're really going to implement and facilitate the strategy that you as board members come up with for fulfilling your mission. So this is a really important part. And one of the things that I have found in my work, and even in my work prior to working with school boards, because I worked my whole entire career for nonprofit organizations, was this idea of really having a strategic plan, having goals and objectives, and aligned our work to try to fulfill that, and making sure that the management team understands what you're all about and what you're working on. And so whether I was involved in fisheries before I came to work for the Association of Alaska School Boards, and I worked for private nonprofit organizations doing that. And we always knew, because it was kind of drilled into it. It was our culture that we knew who we worked for and what our mission was. That really helped in having us understand what our role is. So again, management puts those plans and procedures into place so those outcomes can actually take place. But more importantly, the monitoring and the effectiveness of accomplishing that really results in desired, it really results because of your desire to do that. Then finally, adjusting plans and procedures as need be. So you have some sort of a feedback mechanism to make sure, oh, well, that's working well, or no, that did not work well. And I think the one thing I wanted to link at this point between management and governance is by creating expectations for your management folks and creating, if you have a strategic plan or some sort of a plan where you have goals and objectives, it gives you an opportunity to do a performance evaluation that helps provide the board with information about how well we're doing in fulfilling our mission, but it also helps the manager, the executive director, understand the work that they're doing, what those expectations are, and where they may be excelling, but maybe those areas where there needs to be a little bit more attention. And I really can't stress enough how important that communication piece can be. So oversight of management, clearly expressing these expectations, making sure that plans are in place to get the desired results, even for whatever project might be coming up that the board decides it really wants to focus on, really important. Creating accountability measures. How do you know you've actually gotten there? Okay. When we talk to boards about, coming up with a goal, we talk about goals that need to be SMART. They need to be specific. They need to be measurable. They need to be attainable. Are they realistic? And do they have a timetable? So all of those things play into a goal that helps your manager, your executive director, understand what they need to do and provide you with information about, are you really getting where you want to go?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, Ben, go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry. So, like I said, as an individual board member, if I feel like, and I do not want anyone angry at me, specifically Nancy, but the board seems quiet, like everything is silent all the time. I'm very noisy. I'm very vocal, and I want to hear feedback too, because the only way to make a plan would be for everyone on the board to agree to this plan. How do you prescribe going about making other board members more vocal?
Well, I don't think we can make other board members more vocal. I think the piece that is important is how do you engage board members into, really participating in a discussion that's going to be beneficial to the entire board. If, for instance, Ben, you've looked at the information that's come to you before the board meeting. Maybe you've had the opportunity to talk to Nancy about something, and you still have some questions, but they're really questions for the board. Then I as a board member, that is certainly your purview and your responsibility to engage the rest of the board in having that discussion. The question is whether or not the rest of the board feels like it's a worthwhile engagement, and I can't be the judge of that. What I
Of
can
course
say
not.
is I think people, yeah. What I can say is though that as you look at this and you bring those ideas forward, I think that the likelihood that the board and or even the executive director would engage with you in some of those questions would be, yeah, well, he did his homework. So these are things that, hey, I do have a question about that. You bring up a good point. And so, having a squeaky wheel on the board is sometimes sometimes a really good thing. I mentioned, I think, in the first time we met, that sometimes I felt like the best decisions we made as a school board were those decisions where we had active discussion and debate at the board table. And it was an opportunity for people to really talk about issues.
Yeah, but I'm a little scared. You get intimidated in this environment, in this culture. There's a protocol, and there are people that you're supposed to talk to. There are things you're supposed to do, and you want to say something. I want to know, how do I bring up new ideas without bringing out a whole new agenda?
Okay, so well, sometimes that's not a possibility. I mean, sometimes it is going to need to be added to an agenda. So you're going to find at times that you might have a new idea and it's come from something that you're already working on. So it may need to be added to the agenda. Maybe it's not going to be a discussion for that meeting because the expectation was that you were not going to talk about it there. But you could say, hey, that's definitely something that and others may agree with you. Yeah, we need to talk about that. That sounds like an interesting idea. Let's figure out when we can do that and give it the time that is required. Put it on the next agenda, or whatever the next committee meeting where something like that might be addressed. Those are options for you in terms of bringing that forward. So I would never discourage bringing ideas forward. You may just have to figure out, and the board needs to figure out, well, how are we going to address those if they think they're worthwhile? So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you bet. I mean, those are real life questions for any board member. Any other questions or comments kind of about that, about how that works?
I was just thinking that a really great way to bring the information up is along the same lines of what you were discussing. If it's a thing that comes up as a concern of yours, and it's early enough before a board meeting to ask to have it added to the agenda as maybe a new business item for discussion, something that could be brought to everybody's attention, and then maybe tabled for the next meeting, or like you said, pushed off to the appropriate committee for further discussion, and then to be discussed more in depth as a group at the next board meeting, or set up a special meeting to talk about it again at another time.
Can I ask Abel one question? Being that you are a part of the JAC, how do you approach other board members? I mean, I don't know the board members. I know a couple of them, but I don't know them. So how do you approach them like that, like to bring up a new item, or to bring up a new agenda, or to bring up a dream?
Well, in this wonderful new age that we're living in, email is a really great way to start the conversation, at least as far as initiating a point of contact to bring forth an idea or a concern. I think that's a really great way to start. And then always bringing that with the question to open up for conversation, thought, and reflection on the other person's part what do you think would be an appropriate next step for discussing this further? And do you have any suggestions about?
But I feel like you're bringing it up as if I'm talking to an individual. When I'm talking to a group, I'm talking to a group of people. How do I do that? How do I do that in line with the protocol of this board culture?
Sure. So there's a couple of ways that you can do that. So maybe you know an idea, you've been thinking about an idea and it's related to an agenda item. So you could potentially bring it up during that agenda item and just say, you know, I've got an idea about this. It may not be something, you know, that we can discuss tonight, but I would like to I'd like to have a board discussion about this at some point in time. Could we put it on the agenda? And it's related to something that the board's already doing. The other thing the boards might consider is, do you have an opportunity maybe at the end of the meeting where the board chair would ask the board, is there anything that you would like to put on next week's, or, you know, the next meeting's agenda, or to suggest for a work session or something like that? So it really gives the opportunity for all board members at the table to think about, well, yeah, here's an item that I've been thinking about and that maybe we want to discuss. So in that group setting, that's certainly a way that you can do that. I think outside of that group setting, Ben, there is opportunity for you to, and I think one of the things you ought to do is you should get to know your fellow board members. You know, I think that's really important in some way to begin to establish those relationships so that as things come up, you have the opportunity to maybe have a sounding board for some of the ideas that you have. And what other advocates on the board do you have that are going to be willing to maybe work with you? Because it can be pretty lonely if you're the only voice out there and you get frustrated pretty quickly. You know, I mean, that's the reality.
Yes.
It totally is.
I know. I'm not alone. I'm not alone.
Yeah. Okay.
But at the same time, I want everyone. I think I want to convince everyone of what I believe. And I know that's not really a reality, but okay, I'm listening.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. These are good questions, and it's you know, that's what it takes to figure out what it means to be a board member and to work with a board. So now we're going to actually take a look at some scenarios. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some scenarios up here, and I want you to just in the chat box tell me, is this an example of oversight or is this an example of overstepping? So very first one. A board member is upset with an employee and demands to see their personnel file so they can review it for other suspected disciplinary actions. So this is assuming you're with an organization that has employees. So is this oversight or overstepping? Yeah, I'm getting lots of overstepping.
I meant to say
Right.
overstep.
So the board does not have legal access to any personnel files other than the executive director, which is their only employee. Okay. Good job. Okay, here's the next one. A board member who sits on the finance committee of this organization asks the administrator about some specific expenses on the monthly profit and loss statement. Is this oversight or overstepping?
Oversight.
Right on. Yeah. This is oversight. So this is a proper oversight function. And Jim says, yeah, oversight within reasonable limits, and that's right. And I think Karen mentioned, somebody who is always wanting to talk about each and every penny, and that's not necessarily the where the board can spend effective time.
Lon,
Hey, yes,
may
Ben?
I ask one more question?
Mhm.
Is time really the asset in these meetings? I mean, why so much focus on time? Why so much focus on the penny? I
Okay.
thought that because I feel like a board is supposed to be doing something, making something, creating something.
Well, the board can create, but really the board's function is to provide a structure by which the organization creates something, okay? So it's not the board by itself doing it, it's the board creating an opportunity for the organization to do it and governing that opportunity. Your question about time is a good one. And I think, you're feeling, I'm getting the sense from your feeling is, hey, I'm willing to put in the time and gosh darn it, let's go to this meeting and do whatever it takes. And if that takes hours, we'll do it. Well, we've got a lot of people that have commitments to a lot of different things, as you well know. So time is a resource that's incredibly valuable. And we want to make sure that every board member has an opportunity to participate effectively and efficiently so that that time is well used. I'm not saying that spending a great deal of time on a particular issue that may have a large impact on your organization might be necessary at times, but there can be a lot of work done outside of the board meeting and then brought to the meeting so that the time at the board table can be quite efficient. In other words, if you're discussing an item and it goes around the table, 8 or 10 times and people have said the same thing 4 times in a row, that is not a good utilization of time. So that's kind of a bit about time and making sure that we respect everybody's time and what goes into that.
That's fair enough.
Yeah. Okay, here's the next one. The executive director changes the mission statement of the organization to something they feel will work better in helping secure grant funding. Okay, is this overstepping or oversight?
Way overstepping.
Think that happens every once in a while? It might, but not with our organization. So yeah, this would be overstepping, just in the other direction, that the manager has assumed authority that they don't have. So really only the board has the authority to amend or adopt the mission statement, which is usually, especially for nonprofit organizations, a part of their bylaws. So it's usually focused in your bylaws, and it's a part of your founding documents. So if your mission statement changes, sometimes you have to make those amendments even with the state. So 2 board members come to the executive director with a new strategic plan for the organization, and they demand that the administrator begin to implement it so they can fix the organization. Oversight or overstep? or a really bad idea?
Yes.
I don't know that I agree with the yes from Abel, but it's just because I'm sure I'm overstepping.
Right. So again, this is a piece where, that's the responsibility of the entire board. So, if those two members think they have something that's really special and really great, then it needs to go to, it really needs to go to the whole board, because the executive director doesn't have that authority.
I'm sorry. I have a question. So how do you introduce that new idea? If it's two board members, I have two others than me. So that's three, but there are like 15 or 20 people on the board. How do I introduce this to the other members?
Okay, that's a fair question. So sometimes it depends on, do your board bylaws specify how an item gets on your agenda? Okay, so say you and a couple of board members have an idea for something and you want to bring it to the board. Most of the time, in most practical applications, it's simply letting the board chair, who should be working with the executive director, to help develop the agenda for the meeting. So normally the protocol is that whoever's the board president works with the executive director to develop the agenda. And so you might say, I've been talking to a couple other people and we have an item we would like to get put on the agenda. You might also check and make sure that your bylaws don't say anything specific about, well, how do items get added to the agenda? The other way to do it is when the agenda is presented at the beginning of the meeting, because you guys are nonprofit boards and you're not subject to the Alaska Open Meetings Act, you can add things and subtract things from your meeting agendas pretty easily. There's really no consequences for that in terms of public transparency that elected boards have to face. So you could also ask at the meeting, you could make a motion when the agenda is when you get to the part of the agenda that says approval of the agenda, you could make a motion to add something to the agenda for discussion. And if somebody
do I have to say it like that? Do I have to say it like that?
Do.
Like, okay,
Yep.
like I want to add a motion.
Right. So that would be my recommendation. A lot of people kind of get pretty laissez-faire with parliamentary procedure. And it could happen that way. You could say, I have a suggestion for an item to put on the agenda. And if everybody kind of agrees, then great, it gets on the agenda. If you operate with a board, if they don't go along with it, then you may just have to say, okay, well, I'll try it again next time.
Okay.
The thing I like about having something like using Robert's rules and using motions and taking votes is it gives a pretty clear structure and expectation of what the board is doing. Like there's not a lot of gray area there. I make a motion to add this to the agenda. I get a second for it and the board votes. If the board votes as a majority to add it to the agenda, great, you can do that. If they don't, then they're not going to add it to the agenda that night anyway.
All right. Look, Lon, why don't you go ahead and move on with your presentation? I'm just holding things up. I will stop and we can talk personally. Thank you.
All right, you bet. All right, so here's another example here. A patron of the arts organization demands that the board chair cancel a planned event because they are offended and don't believe the event agrees with their personal values. And the board chairperson explains they cannot cancel an event, but will convey to the board and the administration their concern and objection. So, is this oversight or overstepping? And I see everybody saying oversight. Correct. So remember, a single board member doesn't have that authority, even the board chair, usually. So the impact of overstepping really means that oftentimes it can undermine the authority of your administrator, your executive director. The staff and the board can become confused on what their roles are. It creates inefficiencies among staff. It can undermine the trust between you as a board and your administrator, and that's really important. And then one of the other pieces is, oops, and I left an E off governance, is it really diverts the board's attention from its role, from its governance role. So anybody know what that picture is?
It's a lookout post.
What is that? Yeah, that's a Forest Service observation tower, right? So what does that have to do with what we've been talking about?
Finding the big picture.
Bird's eye view.
Right,
Yep.
yeah. So yeah, in your oversight role, you're kind of above that, and you're kind of trying to keep that, that 15 to 30,000 foot level, and you're not involved in the day-to-day minutia of everything. So in an oversight role, you're really focused on the management of the system. But if you get too far into the management details, then you become micromanaging and you're focused on individual actions instead. So some good questions to ask yourself. Am I acting within the policies that have been established by the board? Am I doing the right thing? Am I focused on what is good for the organization? Am I, as an individual, overstepping, or is the board as a whole overstepping our role? Are we allowing our only employee, if we have one, the administrator, to do the job that we hired them to do? And are we giving them expectations? So that's what I have for you today. And I'm open for any questions or comments, except from Ben. Ben's used up his allotment of questions for today.
Hey, that's not fair. And I have a couple more. I have a couple more, Alon, but I'll wait.
I don't doubt that you do, but let's give some other folks some opportunities.
This is Karen. I just want to say I'm learning a lot from Ben, so thank you.
Great. Go ahead. Was that?
That was Chris. I have
Okay.
a question. Earlier on today, you said that you have to make sure the personnel policy is up to date. Can you suggest how to even start with that? Make sure it's up to date with state.
Yeah. Well, one way to do it certainly is sometimes that's going to take some legal counsel, some review of your, to make sure your policies, your human relations policies are up to date. Certainly take a look at, do you have things in your policies about leave, about, and again, like right now with COVID, there's been some changes, right, that have happened to emergency leave provisions and whatnot for employees. So some of those things you need to be aware of. But sometimes it's going to take somebody that has kind of the experience of an HR person to be able to take a look at your policies. You can get a lot of information off of the Department of Labor website, and you can start there and make sure that you're in compliance. Normally, if you have an executive director or somebody like that, even for a small organization, they should try to kind of keep up to date with that and make sure your policies are in alignment. I do find that, even for Juneau Jazz and Classics, I don't think we've looked at those in some time, and that's something that we need to do. Now, we only have really one employee, so but nonetheless, that's something a board should do and make sure they're up to date. Any other questions?
Lon,
if it's not too, so sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Mariah.
I was just going to ask if you could scroll back to that table in the slideshow that had the board members versus. And then I'll pause for Florinda's question to look at that.
Okay, hang on one second. Let me share my screen again here. Let's see. Because I'm in the presenter mode.
Thanks. Sorry to be a pain.
No, that's okay.
Okay, Nancy's saying she's going to get us the recording, but I just in terms of framing a question, it might help me.
There we go.
Well, I guess some things that I'm not seeing on the list for the board that I recognize may not be necessarily specified in policy, but with regard to board giving policies or, you know, the board's role in providing communication with external audiences through, like, some of us aren't on social media, and so I do worry about doing my diligence as a board member to part of the board not necessarily on the list.
Sure. Yeah, and this is not an exhaustive list. This just kind of covered the big things.
Right.
But you're going to find that there's going to be some of those things that the board may decide, you know, for instance, a communications plan and strategy. Who's going to be involved in that, and which piece is the executive director and staff going to take care of? And then who is going to be the who or what group of people on behalf of the board are going to kind of be maybe more regular communicators with the public. Usually it tends to be the board chair that most of that goes to, but there may be times, depending on a particular project, where you have a certain person who might be involved in a committee or a, you know, a task force or something like that. And as long as the board knows what they're going to be communicating, maybe they get the authority to be communicating some of that information. But I do think it's important for boards to have a communication plan so that there's expectations about who speaks on behalf of the board and represents the board. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah,
you know,
that helps.
The one about giving, I think that's going to be kind of up to each board. You know, I guess I'm not quite certain about exactly what you're talking about in terms of board giving.
That's all right.
Okay.
I believe that a lot of this is just individual, you know, policy or an individual opportunity, but just trying to see clarity where there is some.
Yeah, right. Well, there could be some things, I guess, in board giving. Maybe you have a scholarship fund, okay? And so how does the board go about, you know, determining who they're going to give a scholarship to? That would be kind of an easy one. So yeah, that would be something the board would need to come up with some sort of a protocol and procedure for. And it might end up being something that you want to incorporate into your policy so that there's some perpetuity to it. Okay. Any other questions? Jim, did you have a question?
Yeah, I guess it's probably a question about my personal practices in an attempt to verify that I'm acting reasonably. But my general philosophy is that if I have a question for my executive director and I think it can be answered, say in 5 minutes or less, in other words, it should be a clear question and respectful of their time. My practice would be to pick up the phone and call them and you know,
Yeah.
answer that question in real time. And I am relatively new to this board, but I'm hopeful that it's considered respectful and good practice for me to be able to communicate with my fellow board members by email or in person, again, with the boundaries that I'm not trying to be coercive, I'm trying to get to the point, and that anything I say to a fellow board member, I would, you know, it would be shared, it'd be information I would share in the clear light of day, you know?
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and also, you know, my ultimate goal is if meetings start going 3 hours or 4 hours, I'm probably going to get board fatigue and eventually burn out. And
Right.
So in this day of Zoom meetings, should we have a email list of personal emails and phone numbers for our board members so that we can, fellow board members, so that we can deal with things in real time?
Yeah, I think my suggestion, a couple of things. Your point about calling the executive director about issues, you know, questions that you might have, something that's not going to be, you know, that can be answered pretty quickly. That's pretty simple facts, or, you know, those kinds of things. Absolutely, definitely do that. You should have, each board member should have a relationship with their executive director. And hopefully the executive director also, you know, as you develop that relationship, they'll say, you know, that's a pretty big project. I think you might want to talk to some other board members about what you're requesting. And if I hear from the board, then I feel more comfortable about addressing that. That's just that building that trust relationship. But that same thing also goes with working with your fellow board members. You guys as nonprofit boards don't have to abide by the Alaska Open Meetings Act, as I said. So you can have these conversations with your fellow board members. You know, something comes up or you have an idea about something, you want to be, again, talking about those, gosh, do it. It doesn't mean that you can't have those conversations outside of a meeting. I think you just have to be careful that you don't get perceived as coming up with something that you're going to surprise the rest of the board on, and then that doesn't work in your favor. So, but I completely endorse, you know, get to know your fellow board members, get to know those folks, and understand, well, who could help be an advocate for the perspective that I have or an idea that I have. Who would be interested in that with me? And I think that's a great way to do kind of the homework before you get to the board meeting, so that you're better prepared at the board meeting and that you can propel those ideas forward if need be.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Lon, do you work that through committees? Is that how you would you suggest that's how you do it? Because I have a huge idea. I have it with a couple of other board members. We just went through the communications board meeting. Now, do I just continue moving it forward as people pick up on the idea, or do I address it immediately to the board?
Well, it really depends, Ben. You know, it depends on what the idea is, and if the board feels like, well, that is an idea that we would maybe like to get more information about, and maybe they would say, yeah, let's create a committee to begin working on that, so that, you know, when it does come time for that issue to come to the board table for the entire board to discuss, like there's been some homework done. You know, you've been able to maybe answer some questions that are anticipated that the entire board might have. So committee work can be very effective and not take the entire board's time at a meeting that might have to cover a lot of different topics. So committee work can be good.
Create my own committee, sort
well,
of.
no, what you would want to do is bring it to the board and see if the board would create a committee to which you could work on that issue. Yeah.
Okay.
So again, it's that particular piece would come back to the board to say, you know, yeah, that's a great idea. Why don't we create a committee as a board? We're going to appoint people to go on that committee who wants to serve on it. And we're going to work on this great idea that Ben has brought forward.
What makes a committee?
A committee can be, it can be board members, and it can be other members outside of the organization that you might invite to be part of that work. So maybe you need some particular experience and expertise that you don't currently have on the board. So yeah, and I can help you figure, you know, some of those.
I mean, it's
how you
really
might
just a
figure
matter
that
of
out and bring
protocol.
it to the
It's a
board.
matter of the protocol that I want to go through the
Yeah.
proper protocol. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
Thank
okay.
you.
Jetta, do you have a question?
I do. It's unrelated to that entirely, but tangentially. What is your thought or viewpoint on transparency of a board to its membership in terms of the policies and procedures that may have been passed? I know when you join a board, you're handed a board manual that has the board operating policies, and there's often a staff manual for staff operating policies. If you're just a member without standing in either of those, how do you find out how they do their business? Or should the agency post those on the website for transparency purposes, or make them
I always think that's a great idea, that, you know, to be able to have your constituency see how you actually are organized and do business. That's transparency at its best, really, in my mind. When I deal with school boards have to make their policies available to the public. Okay. And that's a requirement in law. So, but it's best practice anyway. And it's something that I think we should do. I mean, you know, we're getting ready to do a major review of our bylaws with the Juneau Jazz and Classics Board. And we want to make sure that those bylaws and the policies are going to be available to anybody who might go on our website and want to look, well, how's that organization run and what happens with it? Certainly from a personnel point of view, having those policies available, they need to be available if they deal with personnel issues to anybody who is working for the organization. But I think your other point is, how do we make sure that as an organization, people understand we're trying to be transparent, and how do we evaluate as a board that we're upholding those policies? And here's how you do it. You conduct a board self-evaluation every year. And part of that self-evaluation incorporates aspects of, are we following our board policies? And I really feel like that the most effective board self-evaluations are facilitated by an outside person, because that facilitator can come in, everybody can kind of be at the board table and take their hat off. The board chair doesn't have to be the board chair and whatnot, and they can facilitate that discussion so that everybody has an opportunity to be there, and you'll have a lot more frank conversation about some things, and sometimes really work out some things that need to be talked about. But a board self-evaluation can help you go back through that. Reviewing the bylaws. Just take a few minutes every year and just read through your board bylaws. That is incredibly powerful right there. So
thank you.
That's a great question. Thanks.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, it's a good question. Lon, you're talking in regards to a single report from executive director. Right now, there's a lot of conversations about in terms of artistic organizations being led by executive directors, and then a lot of organizations right now are they're kind of jettisoning their artists actually because of the COVID crisis and because of the money situation. Can you talk a little bit about, like, when there's a dual report, and then also about how you know, in this model of the executive director being the lead of an artistic institution, how artists are involved in that as well, or how are they included in this executive or management of the institution.
So are you talking about, maybe there are a number of artists that are involved with an organization. Maybe they are doing something through some grant funding or whatever on behalf of the organization, but they're not board members and they're not employees.
No, I'm talking
Is
about
that
in terms of like, for example, in theater, typically there's a dual report where there's an artistic director and the executive director.
okay?
Or there could be, Junior Jazz and Classics obviously was the founder, was the artist and executive director for a long time. So they had that
Right.
within it themselves. Now I think when I'm looking at the institution, it's kind of been separated now. So the
Yes.
artist is no longer the leader of the institution. It's now the executive director. Is there, I just want to talk to you about like your
Sure.
thoughts about that in terms of like separating those things, and how does that change the organization from being more of an artistic institution into being more of like a institution that just does
Okay,
art? Does it make
sure. Yeah, no, I know exactly what you're talking about. Because I think that's kind of been a concern a little bit with some organizations, and we at Juno Jazz and Classics, we've had to kind of deal with that issue. How does this actually work? Because you're right, we do have an executive director, and then we have an artistic director. We have a new one, Zool Bailey. And they fulfill two very different roles, but they both come under the purview of the board. Okay. So the artistic director, we have a job description for the artistic director, and this is specifically what they do. And it's really, their role is to direct the artistic program for the organization, and the organization exists to support that artistic program. The executive director works for the board and supports making sure that actually happens. So they manage any personnel and they manage the finances, they deal with the logistics, and they serve the board in terms of supporting the board functions, but also work hand in hand with the artistic director. There's some things that even on our organization we're trying to figure out. So while we're talking about instituting an evaluation procedure for the executive director, I think the question in my mind is, well, what about the artistic director? How does the governing board of the organization have a conversation with the artistic director, who is kind of in charge of the arts program? And maybe it's not necessarily a formal evaluation that you might have with an employee, because it's a little different relationship. But nonetheless, that conversation between how the board functions and what the area of function is for the board, because the artistic director can't exist without the governing board. And the organization for Juno Jazz and Classics would have a really hard time existing without an artistic director. So there's not really an easy answer to that, but I think we're understanding that better, and it's not an uncommon situation. I mean, Zool is also the artistic director for, I think, 2 or 3 other festivals around the country. Certainly the Sitka Summer Music Festival, and they have an executive director for their organization and others. So I think the big piece is, what are the what is the area of responsibility, basically the job description for each of those positions? And then what are the board's expectations for that relationship and how that's going to work? And I think in an artistic director sense, that's going to be a unique relationship that we're going to have to establish some way that we can effectively communicate about, yeah, that seems like it's working out, or no, it's not working out. And ultimately the board, because the board has final authority. They're the ones that have the authority for the money and all those kinds of things. The board has final authority on who they want there. But we know how important, for instance, an artistic director position can be. So
Yeah.
I hope that kind of answers the question.
I'm bringing up more of a question because there are other organizations here, I think, because in conversations I've been having across the country, there seems to be a much more, boards seem to be aligned more with the executive director than with artistic directors. There seems to be an misunderstanding of what artistic directors do. And they don't, because a lot of the people on boards have a lot more finance, generally have a lot more relationship or understanding of finance, so they kind of gravitate towards the executive director more so. So in some ways, it was artistic director out. So I'm just leaving it as a question in terms of how is an artistic director, how is an artistic institution led by an artistic director by the art rather than by the finances? They obviously are intertwined together, but it's sometimes I'm kind of posing it as a question, because this is a question that's happening around the country, is like, how do we align ourselves to the art more than and support it with the finances, but are led by the art?
Boom. Boom. I concur.
And I think one way to address that question is, what is your mission? You know, what is the mission of your organization? And so that can help establish, okay, well, what is our responsibility as an organization? I think in Juno Jazz and Classics, we really kind of view it as shared leadership, because you have to, for us, we have to have both. We really couldn't exist if we didn't have both.
Hires the artistic director. Just want to share that point to you.
Yeah, no, that's a great piece. And that's a unique piece to arts organizations, I think, to some degree, is that particular relationship. So who has that role and who has that responsibility, and how does the board deal with that? So, yeah. Okay. Well, I want to respect everybody's time. It's a little bit past 3:30. So thanks everybody for attending. I hope it was informative and you got a little bit of something out of it. And I look forward to seeing you in a month.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right.